Welcome to the J Spot Lounge, where words don't just speak, they echo, where truth drips slow like honey in low light, and every story has a soul. We don't chase the noise, we sip the silence, stir the questions, and serve the real. So pour a drink, light the truth, and let's get into the story they didn't want you to hear. They say you can't escape the Everglades. But what if you were never supposed to? This is not just a detention center. It's a deliberate isolation zone surrounded by predators and cut off from the eyes of the law. The temporary immigrant detention center, built in mid-2025 to house up to 5,000 detainees, is located at the Dade Collier Training and Transition Airport and has been dubbed Alligator Alcatraz by Florida officials and critics alike due to its remote, swampy location, surrounded by alligator and python-infested wetlands. Critics, including immigration advocates, environmentalists, and indigenous leaders, have called it a concentration camp due to its mass detention without trial and harsh conditions. The site is inaccessible to lawyers and families, raising concerns about due process and human rights. It's located in a high-risk hurricane zone and has already experienced flooding and mosquito infestations that pose serious health risks. Some Republican officials have even joked about detainees being eaten alive by wildlife if they try to escape. So, what we're witnessing, folks, is a modern-day version of the mindset that enslaved Africans, tortured them, raped their women en masse, murdered them. The same mindset that decimated the native Indian, decimated them to the point where they would burn them alive in their sleep and while they were in their tents, made them sick with infected blankets. The same mindset of the Ku Klux Klan that lynched en masse thousands and thousands of Black Americans during Jim Crow and would bring their families there to watch them. And that's what we're witnessing today, the same mindset. It's been said, and I'll paraphrase the quote that I'm going to show you, that man is the only animal whose desire increases the more he is fed. And as we are witnessing, the more and more this administration gets away with, the more they are tempted to try and get away with. So what is the legal definition of depraved indifference? The legal tightrope. It is extreme recklessness showing no regard for human life. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. No legal access, no family visits, poor medical care, wildlife threats, and exposure to storms. The conditions of which I just mentioned are the punishment, even before due process is granted. Now, this echoes a lot of the history, as I pointed out a few minutes ago, about slavery and the decimation of the native Indian and Jim Crow during the post-civil rights era. But it also brings to mind Japanese internment camps, Guantanamo Bay, and even earlier immigration raids. And in each case, what does it instill? What is it designed to do? To instill fear, cause isolation. Fear plus isolation equals dehumanization. Now, going back just a second to Japanese internment camps, Japanese Americans were interned during World War II for their safety and, of course, for fear that some of them might have been trying to plot with the Japanese after the attack on World War II. But what's more interesting about that is that they were paid reparation for being interned for their safety. Blacks get nothing for being enslaved. Now, if you recall, during the intro, I spoke about how stories don't just speak, they echo. So let's take a few minutes to examine some of the echoes, historical echoes, that is, that we hear throughout this episode. In the Jim Crow South, Black children were mocked, caricatured, and in some cases, allegedly used as literal bait for alligators. Where the myth or monstrous truth, the message was clear. Black lives were disposable. Fast forward a century later, and we're still using the swamp as a prison. Only now it's immigrants, trapped in tents, surrounded by predators, and stripped of their rights. Now, some of the other additional historical echoes that reverberate through this episode. Then, racist postcards and minstrel songs turned Black children into punchlines and props. Now, politicians joke about detainees being eaten by alligators if they try to escape. Then, no legal protections, no outrage. Now, no trials, no lawyers, no accountability. You see, the cruelty isn't new, not by a long shot. It's just been rebranded. From gator bait to illegal alien, from postcards to policy. See, I often ask people to think about the footage of the 1950s and 60s, the late 50s, early 60s, mid 60s, Jim Crow era, when segregation was the thing, was the norm, and integration was being attacked. And the young white kids who were on the front lines throwing rocks and beating Black people, students and onlookers and white women, the precursor to mom's liberty, screaming epithets and, N-word, go home, we don't want your kind around here. I ask people, where do you think those young kids are today? And whether or not they believe their ideology has changed. Some of those, and a lot of those kids who are still alive, are in Congress. They're shaping policy. If they're not Congress people, they're politicians, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're judges, they're policemen, they're police commissioners. They're just wearing a different suit. The ideology is the same. It's just been rebranded by taking off a sheet and putting on a suit. No, the cruelty is not new. So the term gator bait itself has a deeply disturbing and racist history in the United States, particularly in the South. It refers to a grotesque trope and alleged practice involving Black children during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, the idea that Black children were used as live bait to lure alligators was widely circulated in American popular culture. And while there's no verified evidence and reliable historical records that this was a widespread or systemic practice, the imagery and language were real and horrifying. Postcards, sheet music, and advertisements from the early 1900s often depicted Black children as gator bait, reinforcing dehumanizing stereotypes. These images were part of the broader Pickaninny caricature portraying Black children as wild, expendable, and subhuman. And And many companies printed these images on consumer goods, normalizing the trope. A 1908 article in the Washington Times described a zookeeper at the New York Zoological Gardens using 2 black children to lure alligators out of their winter enclosure, with no public outrage or legal consequences. In 1923, Time magazine reported that colored babies were being used for alligator bait in Chipley, Florida, describing how infants mind you, were placed in shallow water while riflemen waited nearby. In 2020, the University of Florida banned its gator bait cheer after public outrage over the phrase's racist connotations. Now, this history isn't just grotesque, it's a reminder. It's an echo of how racism was embedded not just in laws, but in entertainment, language, and everyday objects. Everyday objects. Remember, the cruelty isn't new. It's just been rebranded. From gator bait to illegal alien, from postcards to policy. Peeps, when a society learns to laugh at suffering, it learns to ignore it. And when it ignores it long enough, it builds camps in the swamp, in silence, away from prying eyes. Because this isn't about safety, it's about scale. And as long as suffering is profitable, the swamps will keep growing. While corporations cash in, detainees pay in silence. Because behind every cage is a contract, and behind every contract, a profit margin. The cages, the silence, the swamp. You've seen what's hidden out there. So join me next time as we follow the money in part 2, the business of suffering.
And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and drop a comment, because silence only helps the system. You've been watching and listening to the J Spot Lounge. Peace.